The build I will show you today is a level 150 Paladin, which is the tankiest build I've created so far. But just because the build is tanky doesn't mean that it deals no damage. The build is really easy to use, so I give it a 5 out of 5 in ease of use. After you applied all your buffs, you can literally turn off your brain and you will still win most of the encounters. If you want to recreate this build from a fresh start, pick the Confessor starter class. You can get to decent damage relatively quickly by looting the Claymore and the Sacred Blade. The Claymore has high poise damage when you charge your heavy attack, so you will be able to kill most things just by stun locking them over and over again. However, the main damage in the endgame we will deal with Siluria's tree. The build has 50 vigor, so I can face tank some attacks while I charge a heavy attack or use Ash of Wars. Since the build is using a lot of buffs, I leveled Mind to 20. Endurance I leveled to 30 since the build uses heavy armor and heavy weapons. Strength I leveled to 50 so I can use heavy weapons to break enemies' poise and stun them. I leveled Dexterity to 16 so I have the minimum stats for the Great AP, which is the weapon with the highest dex requirements the build uses. Intelligence and Arcane I left at the base stats. Faith I leveled to 45 so I can use all the incantations the build needs to become really tanky. If you want to tweak the stats, feel free to experiment. The main melee weapon of the build is Siluria's tree, but it doesn't mean that there aren't good alternatives for the build. I also use Ordovis's Greatsword, which has one of the strongest PvP Ash of Wars in the game. You can use the Ash of War to stunlock most enemies in the game and deal a lot of damage in the meantime. If I want to go full brain dead mode, I use the Great Mace with the Ash of War Prayerful Strike infused to heavy. This allows me to regenerate health just by hitting enemies with my Ash of War. The Golden Halberd is also a very strong weapon to use. The incantation Golden Vow is better than the Ash of War on the Halberd, so never use the Ash of War from the Halberd if you already used the incantation, because it will override it. For enemies that are weak to holy damage, I like to use the Golden Epitaph. It deals a lot of holy damage and is really good to kill skeletons without them being able to revive. I also use Marika's Hammer. The Ash of War of the Hammer is not just good to stun enemies, but it deals a lot of damage as well. For everyone who likes twin blades, I recommend using the Gargoyle Twin Blade with Sacred Blade infused to heavy. One more weapon I like to use with this build is the Beastman's Cleaver with the double slash Ash of War infused with heavy. I also use a wooden shield with the Ash of War Holy Ground on it to buff me even further in boss fights. With that I reach up to 75% damage reduction. But there are more viable weapons for this build to use, so feel free to try around a bit. The seal I use is the Erdtree seal, since I mainly buff my character with it. The few damage incantations I use are mainly meant to deal poise damage. The Erdtree seal is the seal with the highest incant scaling if you only use Faith to boost it. The typical talismans I use are the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, the Two Fingers Heirloom, the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey Icon. If I want to use a secondary weapon, I have to swap the Two Fingers Heirloom with either the Great Jar's Arsenal or the Erdtree's Favor +2. Sometimes I also equip the Blessed Dew Talisman for a passive HP regeneration instead of the Two Fingers Heirloom. If I want to use the Inseparable Blade with this build, I have to equip the Prosthesis Wearer Heirloom instead of the Two Fingers Heirloom to be able to wield it. If you want to use the Gargoyle Twin Blade, I recommend using the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia instead of the Godfrey Icon. But for this build you can use many more talisman combinations to boost specific areas the build might be lacking in. So feel free to try other talismans out, especially if you don't use Ash of Wars while fighting. You can swap the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey Icon for some other talismans. If you liked the video so far, please consider subscribing. This will help my channel a lot and I'm really thankful for it. Typically I use the Strength Knot Crystal tier and the Faith Knot Crystal tier in my Physick. But you can also swap the Faith Knot Crystal tier against the Holy Shrouding Crag tier to boost your holy damage when fighting an enemy that is weak to holy damage. But the Physick is really preferential in this build. I always like the long-lasting buffs, but you might find something better when you try around a bit. Mostly I use buff incantations, but there are also some offensive ones I like to use. I recommend to attune the offensive ones first. I use Lightning Spear for moderate damage while the enemy runs towards you. Honed Bolt. Good for pulling singular enemies so you can fight them singled out. Aspects of the Crucible, Horns, is my favorite offensive incantations with this build. It deals a lot of poise damage and knocks down most enemies in the game. This is perfect to charge a heavy attack as a wake up they won't be able to dodge. Keep in mind this won't work in PvP. But let's move on to the buff incantations. Vike's Dragon Bolt you can use to buff your weapon with lightning damage and to boost your carry weight for the duration of the buff. Golden Vow will boost your damage and defense. Blessing Spoon is the weaker version of Blessing of the Earth Tree, but it's more than enough for your HP regeneration. Try them both out and decide which one you want to use. Black Flame's Protection is the best physical defense boost you can get in Elden Ring. You can even stack it with Golden Vow, which allows you to get very high defenses for around 20 seconds. Protection of the Earth Tree will raise your damage negation against all affinities except physical. But watch out, this one will override Black Flame's Protection, so never buff yourself with both of them. Then I also use Earth Tree Heal for the case I run out of Crimson Tears. Last but not least, I use Flame Cleanse Me for the case I get the Poison, Toxic or Scarlet Rot effect on me and I want to remove it. I also use Consumables that complement the build. The Throwing Dagger and the Kukuri are the consumables of my choice to finish off enemies that just barely survived. To kill enemies that are weak to holy damage, I use Holy Water Pot and the Sacred Order Pot. For the case I use a weapon without holy damage, I use Holy Grease to buff the weapon with holy damage. Boiled Prawns are my way to boost my physical defense in normal engagements. This way I don't have to use FP for Black Flame's Protection all the time. Watch out to never buff yourself with a Boiled Prawn after you already buffed yourself with Black Flame Protection, for it will be overwritten by the prawn. You can also use the Uplifting Aromatic Perfume to dramatically buff your defense for the next incoming blow. To regenerate HP you can use Warming Stones in calm situations. I love the look of the Crucible Tree armor. It is the perfect armor for this kind of build since it has a good defense to weight ratio and a good poise stat as well. It is of course not necessary to use this armor set. If you dislike the Crucible Tree armor, look for another set that fits your style. But try to stay over 53 poise to not be staggered all the time. With this build your survivability is really high, which will help you come out on top in most situations. The main damage will come from Edge of War attacks, but you will still deal decent damage by just hitting the enemies with normal attacks. Every enemy that has high holy resistance is harder to fight, but nothing becomes unbeatable. If you have your buffs active, you will heal over time and have easier fights overall. The only enemy I did not like to fight with this build at all was the Farum Azula dragons, but they are hard to fight with every melee based build. I hope you have a lot of fun playing Elden Ring while using this build. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing, it helps my channel a lot. I wish you all a great day and I see you next time.